Welcome to this episode of the Smart Leaders Sell podcast. I'm Jess, Lorimer, sales coach and leadership expert, and I am really excited to dig down into today's episode. Hey there, poddies. Happy Monday. I am super excited, if a little bit coldy. I don't know whether that's actually a thing. Do we say fluey? Is that the anti-summer cold coming? A little bit fluey at the moment, but have just spoken or will have just spoken at my amazing client Jen Hall's awesome Expert Unrivaled event in Cardiff. Now, I've never actually been to Cardiff, so I am quite looking forward to going. I will fill you in, I'm sure, when I get back on how it actually was. I'd imagine rainy. Whenever I think about Wales, it's always rainy. And actually, one of the interesting fun fact about Jess, here we go, for a Monday morning, is that the only time I've ever been to Wales is when I actually climbed Snowdon. I did the Three Peaks Challenge, climbed some mountains a few years ago. Clearly not recently, because there is no way I'm fit enough these days. And I also remember just crying quite a lot of the way round until one of my friends rightly pointed out that if I kept crying, the tears would freeze to my face, and so that maybe I should stop that. But very, very excited to be in Wales and super privileged and honoured to be speaking at the second Expert Unrivaled event. I was fortunate enough to be there last year, speaking at the inaugural Expert Unrivaled event. So it was super, super exciting. And like you heard on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, we had Jen on. She talked about unique magic bullets and USPs, and she mentioned that I was going to be doing a brand new talk, which I am, and also very excited about that, all about podcasting and actually creating a profitable podcast. And as I was thinking about it, I was like, right, okay, well, I'm going to be doing this talk, and it's the first time I've been asked to talk about creating a profitable podcast on stage. Just preface that. I thought actually it might be fun to share some top tips and tricks with you guys, because it's an interesting topic. And I always assume that if you are listening to my podcast and you're consuming it because you're thinking, I want to build my business and I want to grow and scale, then, and you listen to podcasts, then you might actually be thinking one day you'd like to set up your own podcast. And if you do, then A, yes, we want more podcasts out in the world. And B, you may not know that I have a podcasting program with my lovely podcast producer, Scott, called Podcasting That Pays. You can actually find out about it if you go to podcastingthatpays.com, click the link in the show notes. It's less than £300 and you can create your own profitable podcast. Scott teaches all of the technology that you'll ever need to use to help you edit and produce your own podcast. And I teach lead generation and monetization. And so I just want to walk through a few interesting things about podcasting in general, about what I've learned from now having two podcasts, because obviously I have Smart Leaders Sell, which we all love, and I'm very, very grateful for that. But also I have a second podcast I started this year called Selling to Corporate, to help entrepreneurs who want to sell their services into organizations. And that's been really interesting. It's been really interesting to watch myself, I guess, not make the same mistakes that I did the first time around, and actually run it in the same way that I teach my clients now, who've all been able to learn from my mistakes over the last couple of years podcasting. So as I was looking at podcasting in general, and I feel like this is a word I'm going to say the whole episode, isn't it? It's going to be one of those words, podcasting. By the end, I'm going to be so sick of it, I won't actually remember if it's an actual word or not. But I was looking up some facts and figures, because it's always interesting to me when we're in the online space, we get so caught up in what's new, what's exciting, what's going to be the next big thing, that sometimes we forget to step back and analyze what we already have, what we already know to be true. And for me, one of the most interesting things are the new reports that are coming out about different social media platforms, different types of content mediums, and how they're actually performing over time. Now, we had Dory Clark on the show back in February 2019, And she made some amazing points around podcasts and the fact that most people actually only do 10 podcast episodes before they drop out and they just stop podcasting entirely. And that kind of sent me down a little bit of a rabbit hole for a few months, looking at, because we all know that I love research, and I wondered why. And the biggest reason that came back was that most people felt their podcast was not actually profitable, which again surprised me in a few ways, because when I started digging into the statistics, everything suggested that literally anybody who started a podcast should theoretically, that's the optimal word there, isn't it, should theoretically be successful and should have a profitable podcast, but not everybody does. So interestingly, I was reading a couple of reports. I went over, as I always do, I head over onto Google and I get kind of caught up with all these websites. And there was a really interesting report that Jay Bayer actually referenced. And basically, the report said that despite the fact that podcast listeners are generally more intelligent than any other audience, so yay, if you're listening to podcasts regularly, then it turns out that actually you are 80% more likely to have a university degree or a university level of education, which, you know, okay, that sounds a little bit harsh, doesn't it, to say then you're more intelligent, but theoretically, these people who are listening to podcasts regularly, they are more likely to be critical thinkers. They are more likely to have a university level of education. So they actually like learning. And that's 85%. Okay, 85% of people who listen to podcasts have got a university level education. So if you're American, a college level education. The other interesting thing for me was that 45% of podcast listeners have a household income of $75,000 or more. So actually, that's a relatively good income level, given that the average age of podcast listeners is between 25 to 54. That's a really good level of income for a household and leaves disposable income there as well. So this got me thinking, and by the way, if you are interested, I would actually go down and check out the full report. It's by a company called Edison Research, the podcast consumer report. And I started thinking, well, hang on a minute, if we're all out here and we're all using podcasting as a content medium platform and we're doing the things that we should be doing on it, and our audience, by virtue of being podcast listeners, are critical thinkers, they are intelligent, they like to learn, and they have disposable income, why are people telling me that podcasts are not profitable? And that got me to thinking about some of the mistakes that I made when I started Smartly to Sell, and how I haven't made those mistakes with selling to corporates. And it's really interesting. So for those of you who don't know, maybe I haven't dug into this on the show quite as in depth before, but in the first year of running, so the first year of Smartly to Sell being alive, as it were, in 2017, it made £40,000. That was the amount of revenue that we were able to track back to the Smart Leaders Sell podcast. That's pretty good, right? Like, I think about that and I think, okay, so, 2 episodes a week for 52 weeks, that's 104 episodes, give or take a few for the odd 5-week month. 104 episodes to make £40,000. That starts to sound, you're like, okay, well, what else could I do 104 times and make £40,000? I would also like to point out, what could you legally do 104 times and, make £40,000? But that's quite interesting, isn't it? And, I was looking at it and that works out to the equivalent of £384.61 per episode. Which I got thinking, well, that's pretty good, because once I take off the costs for, me recording it and that time, and obviously Scott working his magic, getting rid of all of Max's snoring and all that kind of stuff, that's a really good profit, actually. That's pretty healthy. That's a podcast that took care of itself in its first year. Thing is, though, selling to corporate, I'm going to say new. I always feel like I'm cheating on SLS. Like when I say that, I'm like selling to corporate. I'm like, oh my God, I'm cheating on my original podcast. But selling to corporate has been going since June this year, and we haven't really marketed it, if I'm honest, all that much. I've told a few people about it, and we chucked it up onto iTunes. You know, we did the whole, right, we'll stick it in Libsyn and we'll just see what happens. That was all I wanted to do, was just see, is there an appetite for this in the market? And in our first month of the Selling to Corporate podcast, we got 121 listens. Woo-hoo. Now, bear in mind, the listens and the downloads for Smart Leader Sell are considerably higher than 121 listens a month. And that panicked me a little bit, if I'm honest, because even when I started out, so when I first started the Smart Leader Sell podcast, in our first month, we got about 1,200 listens. To have 121 was a little bit terrifying for me, you know, and logically, I was like, well, this doesn't really matter. It's an experiment. If it doesn't work out, that's fine. But there was also that vanity part of me that was like, well, hang on a minute, like 121 listens, are you kidding me? Because I think we all have that part of us, you know, as a business owner, we all have that part of us. But here's the thing. It got 121 listens in its first episode and sold 6 event tickets for my corporate event in November. So my Converting Corporates event on the 12th and 13th of November. If you haven't grabbed a ticket yet and you are still on the fence about whether or not you should be selling your services to corporates in 2020, you should be. Seriously, everyone, every single entrepreneur that is service-based needs to add a corporate revenue stream in 2020. You're going to hear me bang on and on and on about it. So if you haven't grabbed an in-person ticket yet or a virtual ticket, and there are still some left, please make sure you go and get one. I'm deadly serious about entrepreneurs adding corporate revenue streams, and if you don't get in before the market is saturated, guess what? You're going to be one of those people that catches on late, kicks themselves and wishes that they'd done it already. Anyway, tangent there. Selling to corporate, first episode, 121 listens, but event ticket sales, £497 per ticket at that point, and we sold 6. So the podcast was already doing incredibly well. Smart Leader Sell had 1,200 listens in its first month, but didn't make the same percentage revenue-wise. Now, obviously, I'm not going to compare apples for apples. Like, I can't say, oh, well, Smart Leader Sell makes X amount per year and Selling to Corporate makes X, so theoretically, Smart Leader Sell looks better. What I looked at, to be fair, was percentages. And so in that first month, you know, the conversion rates for Selling to Corporate was much higher, much higher. And that was really interesting to me. And, you know, I thought, okay, well, I wonder if this pattern will continue. And it did. So Selling to Corporate, we have successfully, I say we because I mean, I've created the episodes, I've done the content, but Scott has actually managed to produce them like a hero. We've created successfully 5 episodes. And those 5 episodes in ticket sales for the Converting Corporate event have netted £23,000 and 1 pence. That's such a random number, isn't it? But £23,000 and 1 pence. And that's in 5 episodes. So remember, we were talking about Smart Leader Sell made 40k in its first year, and the equivalent of £384.61 per episode. That's how much it generated if you look at it from an episode perspective. Over 5 episodes, the actual revenue per episode for Selling to Corporates was £4,600 and 20 pence. And yet, do you know what? In 5 months, we've produced 1 episode per month. And in 5 months, we've never had more than 200 downloads. I think that's pretty impressive. And if you're sat at home and you've been contemplating a podcast for a while and you're thinking, well, yeah, but, you know, everyone says it takes ages to get them set up and, you know, then it takes ages to build your audience, then it takes ages to sell to them. I just want you to think about that. 5 episodes. That's, you know, that each episode for the Selling to Corporates is slightly shorter than the Smart Leader Sell ones that I do. So, you know, we've got a maximum episode length, I think, of about 38 minutes, and that's on one episode. So we've done 5 episodes at, let's even it out, let's say about 35 minutes each. It's just over 3 hours work for me, and then obviously having Scott produce it, and that's at a revenue generation of £4,600.20 per episode. I think that's pretty impressive. And if I could do that, if I could replicate that across every other content medium that I used, I would do it all day long, right? Because 3 hours work for 23 grand, who doesn't want to do that? Where else can you find that kind of revenue? And you might be sat there and you might be talking about Facebook groups and things like that. And I get all of it. Like, I know some people are huge fans of Facebook groups and some people are huge fans of YouTube and things like this. But podcasting is such a growing platform. It's still not saturated. That's the interesting thing. You know, I was looking at this Edison report and they were saying, you know, for every 1,000 YouTube channels, there's one podcast. Isn't that insane? Every 1,000 and there's one podcast. And you know, and when I hear online entrepreneurs and they're saying, I don't know how to get seen and everywhere's so saturated, and you know, they're trying to find new and exciting ways to, I don't know, create themselves as memojis. Is this the new thing? Memojis? I've seen them recently. I wonder why they don't create a podcast and why they don't stick with it. I mean, here's the thing. I guess one of the reasons is that it's not sexy. Yeah, podcasting, it's not like YouTube. You don't get to do fancy editing, and you know, you can't, like, I don't know, make yourself look super hot. Clearly not something I worry about on the daily, but it's not as glamorous, I guess, you know. And most people, they think about podcasting like, I don't know, YouTube's poorer sibling, or YouTube's like clunkier sibling, because it's quite a high barrier to entry. You know, you have to actually think about it. The whole thing with podcasting is that you don't get to cover up bad content with good editing. I should have phrased that differently, shouldn't I? But I'm not going to go back now. But here's the thing, like, you don't get to cover up bad content, as in quality content, value-driven content, with, I don't know, fancy edits and captions and fade in, fade out on video, whatever else you do on YouTube. I've literally no idea what people do with video editing these days, but they all look very fancy. And you can't do that with podcasting. You know, the only thing you could really make fancy is your podcast graphics. And to be honest, we did ours in Canva. So, you know, lucked out there. My team spent about probably 15 minutes creating new designs when we set up both podcasts, and we're like, which ones do you want? We went very plain, very simple. And in fact, if you remember the Smart Leader Sell podcast back in 2017, you'll remember we've been through 3 iterations of our podcast graphic. We went through the pink iteration, which was vile. And I'm not entirely sure why I thought that was a good idea, but it was bright pink. And actually, no, I do remember why I thought that was a good idea. It was because when we looked at iTunes, everybody else's podcast graphics were like really, they're all white or yellow or pastel colors. And I had this like crazy fuchsia color that really stood out on iTunes. That worked really, really well for us, by the way. It helped, you know, stand out on iTunes, and it made people look at it for a bit longer than they probably would have done. And I'm sure we definitely got some new listeners just because the graphic was pretty repulsive. And then we moved and we had the gold graphic, and that was actually pretty nice. That was pretty jazzy. It had the gold background and it had the black title. Still had a picture of my face on it, which is always a little bit shocking for me when I wake up on a Monday morning. I actually am subscribed to the Smart Leader Sell podcast, so I can check that it comes up on all the major podcast players. And that was fine for a while. And again, all looked a bit samey, started getting a little bit, you know, cookie cutter on iTunes. So we changed the graphic, and we now have the one that you are seeing on your screen, on your phone screen, or wherever you're consuming the podcast currently right now, which is really, really nice. Actually, it's super simple design. Again, all designed to stand out in iTunes in the charts and help new listeners find the podcast and think, oh, that's something that looks a little bit different. Selling to corporates, the Selling to Corporate podcast, again, 15 minutes on Canva. We'll probably change that at some point. It's not a final design. It's okay, but it's not final. Nothing with me ever is. But isn't that interesting? How different and how quickly like both started being profitable. And I think, for me, there are 3 top tips I want to share with you today about how you can, if you want to start leveraging podcasting, and I hope you do, because I firmly believe that podcasting is the future. Whoever you sell to, I firmly believe it's the future. There are a few things that I would do or have done differently with selling to corporate. I'm going to refer to that from now on as STC. Actually, no, I'm not. I've just heard myself say that out loud and was like, nope, that sounds a little bit dodgy. But there are a few things that I've done differently with my second podcast than with this one. And I've learned from those mistakes, so I think it's only fair to share the wealth. Obviously, if you do want to go and set up a profitable podcast, please don't go out there and just buy some boring course about podcasting that teaches you all of the tech, but none of the actual useful stuff that you need to make it profitable, like lead generation and monetization. If you want to learn those things, please buy Podcasting That Pays. It's podcastingthatpays.com. It's run by me and Scott. I'm pretty open in it about how I've made money from my podcasts. I share all of my lead generation strategies and all my monetization strategies. And Scott covers the tech in a ridiculous detail and keeps updating it every time anything changes. So you get an absolute bargain and you get to learn stuff that's going to make the podcast profitable as opposed to just sound good, which is useful, but doesn't make you the money. So top 3 things that you need to think about when it comes to running a profitable podcast or starting. Number 1 is clarity. Who is it actually for? And this is an interesting one because so often, and I did this when I set up the Smartly to Sell podcast, I went, well, it's just for people who want to learn about sales. That was wrong. That was a big mistake. It wasn't clear enough who it was for and what the purpose was for the podcast. And in actual fact, over the last 2 years that Smartly to Sell has been alive, it's had different iterations. We've had times where it's actually been a much better fit for people who are making less than 5K a month. And we've had times where it's been a much better fit content-wise for people who are making 20K a month plus. And actually, if I was to go back and do it again, and maybe I'll do this at some point, maybe I'll refine this podcast. I'm not sure. Write in, let me know, hit me up with an email and tell me what you would like to see. But if I was going to start it again, I'd be much, much clearer about specifically who this podcast was for, what the purpose of the podcast was for them, and what revenue generation level that particular person was at. Now, I did this with selling to corporates. It's a very, very specific topic. It's targeted towards a very specific type of person. And you know what? It works. The listener base is consistently going up month on month. Okay, no, we haven't hit 200 downloads a month yet, but you know what? It's looking good. We even hit 194, so we're up there. We're getting there, and it's grown consistently since month 1 with 0 promotion, which I think is pretty impressive. Okay, but that's because it's targeted, and it's because it's very clear. So if you're going to set up a profitable content medium, podcasting, YouTubing, blogging, whatever you want, get really clear. Who is this for? What is the purpose for them? What are they going to gain from it? The second thing that I think is really important is content creation. I said earlier, you can't escape bad content on a podcast. If your content is crap and it's not value driven and it's not designed for an audience to get the best use out of it, and it's not that friendly and people just feel like they're listening to you and it's super awkward, your podcast probably isn't going to be that successful. Now, there are some things there that you can get over with practice. Being awkward to a microphone. Yep. That you can get over. Just practice talking to yourself. Clearly, I do it a lot. It's either that or Max just does not listen to me anymore. I'm not sure which. But that's the kind of thing that you can get over with practice and becomes a habit. Actually creating good content that focuses on delivering value to your listener but also that strategically ties in with your sales plan is tougher. And I have a whole module on this in podcasting that pays for that very reason, because it isn't easy necessarily. And that's because it involves two things. One is, do you actually have a clear sales strategy? Do you know what you're selling every single quarter? Do you know what you're selling every year, every 6 months? And you plan your content strategically around that. If you don't, then it is going to be way more difficult. If you're somebody who's like, oh, but I love living life on the fly and I'm just like going to sell whatever I'm in flow with, sure, may work, probably won't work consistently. Okay. So when I started selling to corporates, the podcast, not doing it necessarily, I created content very, very specifically. I knew that my big focus was to sell out the corporate event in November. And so I knew that I wanted to strategically plan content and be transparent with my audience, be transparent with my new listeners. So every single episode on the Selling to Corporates podcast, I've sold blatantly, transparently, openly, and proudly, I'd like to point out, at the beginning of every single episode. And obviously it's made a lot of money. So I'm not unhappy about that decision. The thing is, people don't mind the sales pitches because they're actually getting value from the content. So they're perfectly happy to listen to those sales pitches because the value is still there. Even in the pitch, there is still value. Okay. So that's the second tip. And then the third thing is consistency. And this is an interesting one for me. I remember back in the day, 2017, I think it was like July, maybe early August, when I first ever talked to Scott about setting up Smart Leaders Sell. We talked about consistency and we talked about the reality of what it would take to create 2 episodes a week. And Scott warned me then, look, it's a lot of work. And with podcasting, you have to be reliable for your audience. Like, you can't say you're going to do 2 episodes a week and then, 1 month be like, oh, well, screw it. Like, I'm just not going to show up this month. That's not how it rolls. And consistency was actually the biggest thing that worried me about podcasting, because up until then, I'd been using content mediums that were relatively reactive. Email marketing, I can send out an email whenever I feel like it if I want. I don't necessarily have to have everything automated. I don't necessarily have to have everything batched. I'd been using Facebook groups, and again, you can do that pretty much on the fly if you want to. It's why, incidentally, a lot of marketing now is not working as well, because, I was doing that like 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And back then, not a lot of people had great groups. So, it's quite easy to be winging it. If you had a group that was small and engaged, like, you can absolutely do that. But with podcasting, you can't. Like, you have to be consistent. You have to be there when you say you're going to be there. You have to batch your content. You have to think about it. And you have to be really consistent about that. So when I decided I was going to set up a second podcast, the Selling to Corporate podcast, it was interesting because I didn't think, oh, I want to do that twice a week. That's a topic that needs to be talked about twice a week. In fact, for me, I felt like I wanted to do a more in-depth episode that people could learn from and go back to repeatedly, which people do, covering something super, super specific about selling to organizations. And so we produce 1 episode per month for that. Consistently comes out second Wednesday of every month. It's there. It's on all the major podcast players. That's when it's uploaded. But that's what happens. That's its consistency. So much less, 1 episode a month instead of 8 or potentially 9, depending on how it falls. And you've got to think about that. You've got to really think about your consistency with any content medium, but podcasting in particular, because your audience does expect you to come out with content regularly. And you've also got to think about what you'll need to give up. Now, I'm going to be posing this question at Jen's event when I'm talking about podcasting there. But I want to pose it here too. If you decide to set up a new content medium, whether it's podcasting or blogging or YouTubing or whatever you want, do you really understand what you're going to have to give up in order to do that? So it's not just about like the time thing. Oh, well, if I'm spending time batching podcast episodes, like I'm going to have to, spend perhaps less time being reactive in a Facebook group. It's also old habits and, mindset things that come up. For me, one of the things that I had to give up when I started podcasting, particularly with Smartly to Sell, was I had to give up the validation that I felt when other people knew my numbers, right? People could see with a Facebook group, oh, you've got 2,000 people in a Facebook group. Oh, you've got this many people on the email list. Oh, you've got this many people who follow your Facebook business page. With a podcast, only I can see my stats. Now, I'm not necessarily a massively needy person in terms of metrics. I very rarely go out there and sell based on, oh, look, well, I've done this, so you can do it too, because obviously, numbers don't change between work ethics and industry and all that kind of stuff. But it did alarm me a little bit because, when I set up Smartly to Sell in 2017, I was getting asked to be on summits and I was getting asked to participate in different like giveaways and things, which obviously I quit doing. Please check out my episodes on why I've done that. But all of them specified, well, you need like a 5,000 person email list, or you need a 5,000 person audience, or whatever the kind of thing was. I think now that's gone up. I'm not sure. Also, now people expect you to pay for the privilege of going onto their summit or their giveaway that they've invited you to do because they want you to pay for the tech. Like, bollocks. Not happening. And then they try and tell you, and this is just a complete side note, but really people should not be falling for this anymore. It's 2019, like, grow up. They're like, oh, it's cheaper than Facebook ads. No, it's not. It's really not. Me paying you $150 for a return that I have zero idea about because you're telling me you invited a bunch of people with great email lists and I have no idea who any of those people are, or if their audience is irrelevant to me, or if their audience even wants to know anything about what I'm talking about. That is not cheaper than Facebook ads. It's also not cheaper than the indignity of standing outside with a sandwich board on my chest. Exactly the same kind of thing. Anyway, enough ranting about that. But this whole thing about validation of metrics and people being able to see publicly like how big an audience I had, that was kind of scary for me. I had to give that up. I had to not be bothered by it. I had to put it to one side and think about what was I doing instead? What was I gaining? Okay, yes, I was giving up potentially some external validation and admiration, but what was I getting in return? Well, actually, I was getting these amazing new podcast listeners in my audience who were really loyal, who were genuinely interested in what I was talking about, who were showing up every week wanting to learn about sales. So there was payoff there for me. I also had to give up I don't know whether reliance would be a good word, but that almost addiction to social media. And I talked about this on the podcast last Christmas, how I wanted to really step away and step back from social media because it's become this really quite toxic environment. And setting up my podcast, I always knew that setting up Smartly to Sell would mean that I spent less time in my Facebook group. And that is absolutely true today. If you're in my Facebook group, you know that I go in there, I promote the podcast. If people ask questions, I answer them, but it's not the same place it was. And in fact, we are shutting it down. We're going to be shutting it down and replacing it with something much, much better. So stay on the lookout for that. It's coming in a couple of weeks. But that scared me too. I had to give up. I had to go left when everyone else was going right. Everyone's like, oh no, grow Facebook groups. Even now, people keep telling me this. They're like, get your Facebook group bigger, go on a Facebook Live, da da da. And I'm like, I've done all that. I've done that. I used to do Facebook Lives every day, Monday to Friday, 30 to 45 minutes a time. And it just left me feeling a little bit hollow. Whereas podcasting, I love it. We get emails from people who listen to the podcast. I get so excited. And I love it. When somebody writes in and they say, I had an email recently, I say recently, do you remember when I did that episode on, how the online world is shifting? There's a podcast listener who I adore called Isabel Strambio. And she emailed me and she said, thanks for this episode. Like, I really loved how honest you are being. And that meant way more than like 300 people joining me on Facebook Live and be like, hey, Jess, what color socks are you wearing today? Because that's a person, and we get lots of these emails. Isabel, I remember your email particularly. It stood out to me because it hit my inbox, I think at like 5 p.m. I just had a glass of wine and I was like winding down for the day. And I'd been particularly worried about that episode and how controversial it was. And yours is the first email that we got about it. And it sticks in my mind for that reason. But we get a lot of these. And the reason that they mean more is because people have to do more. They have to make more effort to get in touch. It's not easy necessarily to, go to all the hassle of digging out my email address and actually proactively sending me an email that says, yeah, that was a good episode, I like that. There's a barrier to, I would say barrier to entry, but really what I mean is barrier to action there that doesn't necessarily happen on reactive platforms like Facebook or YouTube, because any old person, like if you're sat there, if you're on the platform, if you're scrolling past, anyone can comment, right? It's easy. And there are those things that you do have to give up in order to have something that is better, that is different. And that's why I love podcasting. For me, it's more meaningful. The people who get in touch are people who've overcome a barrier to action immediately. They've made an effort, they're building a relationship, they're showing up every week for themselves and for me, and I really appreciate that. So there we go. If you're thinking about creating a podcast, those are my 3 top tips. Get clear. Who is it for? What's the purpose for them? What's the purpose for you? Create good content. Don't think you can disguise bad content with good edits, because it's not going to happen in earbuds. And be really consistent with it. Be transparent with your audience. If you're not going to show up more than twice a month, just tell them that. That's fine. It's all good. Nobody cares. And if you are thinking about setting up a podcast, you want to know how to generate steady leads from it, you want to know how to make money from it, go to podcastingthatpays.com. Seriously, grab a copy of the course. It's going to be more expensive in the new year anyway. And we've had some phenomenal people who have gone through and who have set up podcasts as a result. We've got I'll just give you a few examples actually, because there's some really interesting things. And one of the things that I always find is that people say to me, oh, but Jess, I can't set up a podcast because I'm in X industry. So not to sell the course, but to kind of give you a highlight of some of the people who've gone and set up podcasts in the industries that they're in. We've got Sandra Greenbank, who is in fertility nutrition. She took the course and she has a podcast. It's literally just come out. And it's amazing. It's going to be a combination of interviews and her own solo episodes. And I think that's really, really exciting. It's bold. It's in an industry that is sensitive, and because it's sensitive, sometimes we can feel like, oh my goodness, well, how can we broach that topic with people? Well, the great thing is that if it's a sensitive topic, guess what? People get to listen to it in their ears, right? It becomes easier for them. And I think that's really, really powerful. So we've got Sandra, who is running her podcast in the fertility nutrition space. We've also got Barhi Vanderbilt, who set up a podcast, and her podcast is about healthy eating for children, which I think is a very, very niche topic and is doing well. Like, she's consistently produced this podcast and people really like it. They listen to it regularly, they get involved with it. And I always think that's a good sign. If you're generating leads and conversations from your podcast, that's a really, really positive sign. Susan Hay, who is the founder of Thrive magazine. So she's got a magazine dedicated to health and wellness, which is awesome. But she's actually got a podcast that is based around building a health brand, which is, again, super targeted, super niche, combination of interviews and solos. Simple, but she's really consistent with it and it works really well. So we have these people who are in these, and I realize as I'm saying this, because I've completely done this off the cuff, that I'm talking about people who have, mainly health focused businesses, which is really interesting because, when people talk about things that typically do well or make money, we don't always talk about health and wellness entrepreneurs because they don't always do that well. Sometimes health and wellness people find it more of a struggle because obviously, you're focused on delivering other people's health and wellness solutions. But we also have Nadine Powery. She's got an amazing podcast that she created. Nadine honestly aced this course. Like, she really did. She put in a lot of work, a lot of time and effort. She's got a great podcast on courageous conversations and how to have leadership conversations. And again, it's a combination of solo and guest episodes, but it works really, really well. And it helps deliver content, make her content accessible, which I think is an awesome, awesome way to go about positioning your content and making sure ultimately that your audience, do get the content that they're actually looking for, that they're looking for help with. But we've had an awful lot. We even had Anne Castro, and she created a podcast about caring for parrots. Most niche thing, but people loved it. And her podcast hit #1 in its category on iTunes and did incredibly well. And she had this phenomenal graphic as well with her own parrots on it, which I loved. But it just goes to show you can really create a podcast about anything. Much like a Facebook group, you can create them about anything, but there is always going to be somebody out there who wants to listen and who wants to have it in their ears and feel like they're having a secret conversation with you. And that's what I think the power of podcasting is. So thank you very much for listening to the podcast, for being a Smart Leaders Sell listener and a poddy. I always do really appreciate it. And if you are also listening to the Selling to Corporates podcast, yay, you're one of our 194 listeners for this month, which is awesome. And like I say, if you haven't got a podcast yet and you are thinking about it, if you think, do you know what, I have a question that I just want to ask, like, is my podcast idea valid? Like, would it actually work? What does Jess think of my idea? Shoot me an email. Like, I'm not going to be able to tell you how to set up your podcast and, give you all the answers and everything. But if you've got an idea and you think, I just want some kind of validation that would be cool, or that there are other people out there who would be interested in listening to a podcast like that, shoot me an email, jessica@jesslorimer.com, and I will tell you honestly and transparently, and I won't even try and sell you podcasting that pays, but it's the best resource out there if you do want to set up a successful and profitable podcast. So there you go. Have an epic week. I'm very, very excited. And we're doing something a little bit different over the next couple of weeks. You will be noticing a slight shift in Friday scheduling. It's going to be epic. I'm not going to tell you about it yet, but make sure you tune in on Friday. It's going to be exciting. It's going to be a bit different. And I am eager to hear what you have to say about it. I'll see you in Friday's episode.